There's a pattern that repeats like clockwork every single year in the card market, and once you understand it, you can use it to spot opportunities to profit before the crowd catches on. Now, the easiest way to learn this is to look at some actual examples. So today I'm going to walk you through the exact picks that I made 6 months ago. I'll explain the reasoning behind each pick, and then we'll take a look at what actually happened to each player's card values so you can get a feel for how this actually works and start to make some of these types of plays for yourself. Now, before we dive into the picks, the one thing you need to understand is just the basics of the strategy itself. So the whole play is based on timing and understanding where the crowd's attention is going to be and understanding what types of players are going to be in demand. So the basic premise is that on the way out of the season, attention starts to move elsewhere as other sports are getting ready to start, and then values start to pick back up again and sometimes even rise to all-time highs on the way back into the following season as the attention returns to that market and we see excitement peak for that sport. I call this strategy the seasonal swing play. And while the names change every single year, the actual pattern itself does not change. It's been the same thing for the past 20 years in a row, so I have a lot of confidence that it's going to continue to happen this way. So this is a pattern worth understanding. So instead of giving you a lecture, let's just look at how this actually played out. Now, for context, I run a program where I help aspiring card investors get started and become more profitable with cards. And one of the things that I do for each sport each year is put together a guide for the buying season where I specifically break down the strategy, how it works, what types of cards to target, what types of players to target, and then a list of the specific players that I'm targeting for each particular buying season. So it looks something like this. And I'm not going to go through the whole guide. That's not the point of this video, but I do want to get into the list itself. Now, as we go through this, there's two things to keep in mind. So first of all, this was originally published back in September of 2025, long before any of these moves actually happened. And the goal was to use what I know about the seasonal patterns and how they work to predict which players' cards would actually rise going into the season. And second of all, as you're watching this, don't focus so much on the individual names. Focus on why those names made the list in the first place, because that's the part that you can actually use moving forward. So the first category we'll talk about are players going from their rookie year into year 2. And I like to call these players second years. I know, super creative, right? But what we're looking for here are players who showed some flashes of brilliance. So this is top prospects or top performers as rookies who showed the crowd, this is who I could be. And usually that's enough to create some excitement going into year 2 because the crowd looks at those players and says, okay, this guy could be better next year than he was last year. And that sounds like opportunity to me. So the players that I named for last year's second year category were Roman Anthony, Nick Kurtz, James Wood, Jack Caglione, Jacob Wilson, and Christian Campbell. Now, my favorite of these plays by far was Roman Anthony. This guy's an absolute stud. He's been a top prospect for a couple of years now. Elite bat, elite power. And what I like is that during the 2025 season, when he got called up to Boston, he actually played really well. So everyone got a little taste of what might be possible for this kid. But then as football starts and basketball starts and attention moves away from the baseball season, that's what creates a buying opportunity for his cards. And when we dig into the data here, you can see that his card ladder index climbed by 45% between September 1st and March 31st. And the coolest part about this is during this time, yeah, there's some spring training games going on. Yeah, he was a part of the WBC, but for the majority of this is just preseason hype building. This has nothing to do with actual performance because none of those games actually count. So this is just excitement building up before the season, and that's exactly what we want to take advantage of with this strategy. The next name on my list was Nick Kurtz, who was coming off of a Rookie of the Year season, so very obvious candidate for a player that I thought that the crowd might be in on going into year 2. The logical argument, of course, is, okay, he did that in year 1. What could he do when he takes another step forward in year 2? And if we look at his Chrome Auto PSA 10 values, we're looking at 700-800 for the first part of the fall here. And when you get to the March timeframe, you're seeing sales over $1,000 for the exact same card, up in the $900 to $1,200 range. So once again, some nice rise here without even playing another game. Another one is James Wood. He had a great start to 2025, showed what was possible, and then kind of fell off in the second half and didn't have a very good end to the season. But the damage had been done because people got a chance to see what he was capable of in the first half, and so his values ended up climbing by almost 17% between September 1st and March 31st. Next on the list is Jack Caglione, and he is a guy that was a top prospect with monster power. And little hack for you guys, players that hit home runs are almost always in demand. So chicks dig the long ball, and so do middle-aged people who collect sports cards, I guess. But when we get into his data here, his Chrome Auto PSA 10s were in the $300 to $400 range for the first part of the fall. And as we got closer to the season, you're seeing the sales in the $500, $550, $600 range here, and even touched $750 as we approached the season. So another name that fit the pattern quite nicely, even though he didn't have a great showing in his rookie season, people are going off of what they see his potential to be. Since he's still young, up and coming, and people say, okay, year 2 is going to be a lot better. He's going to figure it out. And that's what they're spending their money on. So if we can identify those types of players in advance, that's what gives us some opportunity to make these flips between last season and this season. Next on the list was Jacob Wilson. So he actually started off the year in 2025 really strong and got overtaken by his teammate Kurtz for the Rookie of the Year, but ultimately his Chrome Auto PSA 10s were in the $250 range in the early fall, and by the time we got closer to the season, they were hitting $400, $420, $425 by late March. So once again, another player where people see what's possible, and then they start loading back up on that player as the attention returns to the baseball market going into the season. And finally, we have Christian Campbell. So if you look at the data, this was actually one that you could say I was wrong about, and I'll own that, where he actually fell by 12%. But this is actually looking at that same time frame between September 1st and March 31st. And if we actually change this to show from October 1st until March 31st, you see a different story where he actually climbed by 24% when you're looking at his card ladder index here. And so the key understanding is that this isn't always going to be perfect for every single player. There is going to be some nuance. Some players are going to see a little bit of a dip sooner or later than others. Some players you might have to be more patient on and take kind of a wait and see approach before you jump into their market. But in the spirit of being fair and not cherry picking the data just to make myself look good, I did want to show that yes, it is possible for players to actually lose value during that same exact September 1st to March 31st stretch, even though there was opportunity to win on Campbell if you had waited a few extra weeks. Okay, so that's the idea behind second-year players. It's that early flash of performance or even just potential that leads to building excitement on the way into the following season. And the next group builds on that a little bit here. So the next one is top prospects. So with this group, I had on my list from September, Connor Griffin, Kevin McGonigal, JJ Weatherhold, Leo DeVries, Spencer Jones, and Lazaro Montes to wrap up the list. So with second-year players, we're reacting a little bit more to what we've already seen them do at the major league level. But with top prospects, we're actually getting out a little bit ahead of that because they haven't made their debuts yet. Now, the first one we'll talk about is Connor Griffin. He was the #1 overall prospect, a very obvious choice for the buying list back in September based on the enormous season he had had in the minors in 2025. Now, I think people expected him to be pretty good, but people didn't quite realize how good he was, myself included, when we go back to the beginning of the 2025 season. But by the end of the year, he had shown that he was an elite level prospect, and this is the exact type of name that generates a lot of excitement when people come back to the baseball market in the spring and are looking at, all right, who was great last year? Let me go and find some of those cards, because the perception is that you can get in on the ground floor with these prospects, even though the values are already pretty high to begin with on some of the top names. Because of how young a lot of these guys are, there's this perception in the card market that there's enormous upside with their cards. And so once again, the idea here is not to bet on who's actually going to become the next superstar in the majors. It's just to get ahead of the crowd and pick the types of names that the crowd is going to be betting on for the upcoming season. So with Griffin, we saw his Chrome Auto PSA 10s in the $600 to $700 range in early September, and he was one of the meteoric rises in the spring. You can see copies of that card topping out over $2,000 for the exact same card just a few months later here, and ultimately they wound up in the $1,750 range by the end of the spring. So imagine buying a card for $700 back in September and just setting it on your desk for 6 months, pulling it back out and selling it without the guy even playing another game, and you make $1,000 on that card. Not bad, right? Now, it doesn't always work out that way, of course, and there's always risk when you're investing in players like this, but that's the power of the hype and the excitement going into the season. That's the power of the seasonal swing strategy. Next on the list is Kevin McGonigal. So he's one of the Tigers' top prospects, and his Bowman Chrome Auto PSA 10s were in the $500 to $600 range in the early fall, and by the time the spring ended, he was up near $1,000 for his Chrome Auto PSA 10s for the exact same card. So another monster win if you had the foresight to get into his cards at the right time of year. Next one, JJ Weatherholt, yet another top prospect here. So he was in the $300 to $400 range for his Chrome Auto PSA 10s back in September. And you see in the spring here, they are in the $600 to $700 to even $800 range for that exact same card. Are you picking up on the strategy here? You find the top names, the guys that are going to generate some excitement, you get into their cards early enough, and you get ready to sell when the opportunity presents itself. Now, the mistake I see a lot of people making at this point is you see the cards rise and they keep going, and then you get to the season and it's like, well, I'm just going to hold into the season and see what happens. The problem is once the season starts, it's performance rather than the hype or the excitement that drives values. And so if the player doesn't perform at or above the card market's expectations, you're going to see the values fall back off. Now, if you get it right, you can make big money. It's just a lot harder to predict performance compared to predicting this seasonal swing pattern. So I'm a big fan of selling before the season and locking in the profits while they're there. All right, next one I had on the list was Leo DeVries. So another top prospect, same exact pattern, $300 or so in the early fall here. And then we get to the season and they're in the $450, $500, $600, $700 range for the exact same card. So once again, another example of a top prospect who picked up some steam before the season. Next one I had was Spencer Jones for the Yankees. So big time power prospect here. And you can see his chart. I'll get my face out of the way here, but you can see over the same exact time frame from September 1st to March 31st, his Chrome Auto PSA 10s climbed by 47%. Once again, top prospect, buy him at the right time, sell him at the right time, and you can do some damage. And then finally, we had Montez, who wasn't quite as big of a win as the others, but he still climbed by about 14% between September and March. So the main thing with top prospects here is you don't actually have to pick the diamond in the rough. You can just look at the top names and focus on the guys that you think are going to get attention from the crowd. That's the name of the game. And by the way, I know we're talking a lot about baseball here, but the framework that I use for this strategy is actually the same for all sports. So the baseball buying window has already passed, but the NFL and the NBA windows are wide open right now, at least at the time of this recording. And I've already put together and published my full guides for both. And if you want access to both guides, you can grab them inside my card investing community, Ignite, right now. They break down the full strategy for each sport, including the specific details that make each sport's buying and selling seasons unique, along with the exact players I'm personally targeting. I'll link that below if you want to join the Ignite team and grab those, but otherwise, let's get back to the video. All right, next category I like to focus on is rising stars. So players that are beyond their second year, so they don't qualify for the second year category, and they're on their way to stardom, but maybe they're not a household name just quite yet. And we're looking for players who are perceived to have the ability to be better next year than they were last year. That's all we're looking for here is, can you find that narrative where the player is kind of on the rise from one year to the next? So one thing I like to look for here is, are the players' stats actually increasing from one year to the next? Or maybe they were flat for a couple years to start their career, but then they figured something out and now they're starting to take some steps forward. Those are the types of players I like to focus on here. So on my rising star list, I had Cal Raleigh coming off a monster season last year, Elly De La Cruz, Corbin Carroll, Wyatt Langford, and Jackson Chourio. So let's dig right into the data here. The first one, Cal Raleigh, coming off of that 60 homer season. And I actually thought he might see a little bit more rise than he did, but he was so bad during spring and during the World Baseball Classic where he had 0 hits that he didn't actually see as much rise as I thought he might. But he still ended up 15% between September 1st and March 31st. Now I want to touch on that because that's an important nuance here. Usually the way I look at spring training is that it's almost like a bonus where it can help if you perform at a high level, but it generally isn't going to hurt because the games don't count yet. Now, the problem with Raleigh is he literally went 0 in the World Baseball Classic, like did not get a hit. And I think that actually ended up negatively impacting his values a lot more than we would normally see during the spring. All right, next one, Elly De La Cruz. So a guy that's kind of been on the verge of stardom for a few years here, but he saw a 36% rise between September and March. The next one I had on my list is Corbin Carroll. So really thought that he would see more rise. I thought people would be more excited about him coming off of what he did last year, although he did end the year a little bit flat, and he also broke his hand during spring training, so sometimes that can have a negative impact, and that may have held his values back. So for Carroll, I'll claim an L since he didn't really move, but the good news is he didn't really move, so it's not like you're taking a massive loss here. You might have to eat the fees if you bought something in September and then sold it at or near your cost in March, but that's one of the things I actually like about this strategy. If you just think about logically, if we're buying at the time when the fewest people are paying attention to the market for baseball cards, and then we're selling at the time when the most people are paying attention and the most people are excited about baseball cards, it's almost like illogical for values to be lower, right? Now, it can definitely happen. You can definitely lose on this strategy, especially in scenarios where a player might have been overinflated to begin with. But if you understand what I'm saying, usually there's a lot more upside than there is downside on this type of a play. All right, the next one on my list was actually my favorite play from last year's buying season list. Wyatt Langford delivered again, and he was up by 51% between September and March. So another guy who, if you look at what he did last year, he put up a WAR of over 5. So people are saying, okay, his numbers aren't amazing if you just look at his raw numbers, but the full package of what this guy is and what he brings to the field, and he's still young and projectable. I think a lot of people were jumping back in on his cards thinking, okay, year 3 is when he's going to take that big leap to the next level and really lock in stardom. So we'll see if that ends up actually unfolding that way, but for our purposes, if you bought in September and sold in March, you'd be sitting pretty on a whopping 51% profit. Last one on the list for the rising star category was Jackson Chourio, and Chourio saw some big rise. He was up by about 38% between September and March. So once again, just looking for players who have done some decent things on the field, and there's some upward trajectory where it's easy to make the argument that they're going to be better moving forward than they were last year. That tends to be what the crowd is interested in, and those are the players that I like to try to target. Okay, so the next category is a fun one. So this one's a little bit different. I call this one on the move. And this is looking at players who are going to be free agents who we think are going to be moved to a different team. Now, the way I usually approach this is to look at who are the top free agents in the upcoming class, and then I'm buying those guys in anticipation of the big market teams jumping in. Now, of course, it helps if they actually sign with the Yankees or the Mets or the Dodgers, but sometimes it's just the anticipation of who they might sign with that can boost card values. So for this year, I only had 2 guys on the list, Kyle Tucker and Kyle Schwarber. Now, Kyle Tucker was the clear-cut #1 free agent in this draft class, and typically that means you're going to have the biggest market teams competing for you, and it worked out this time. He ended up going to the Dodgers, and that's what this is right here, where you see this little spike is when the news broke that he was going to LA. A lot of his cards climbed quite a bit, and he ended up 26% between September 1st and March 31st. But what I find interesting is this is just his index, and if you look at some of the rarer cards during that same exact time frame, some of them jumped by 100, 150, 200%. So the impact of a move like this can be enormous if you have a player going to a true big market team. Now, it doesn't always work out because the other Kyle here, Kyle Schwarber, actually did not change teams. He re-signed with the Phillies, and his market basically stayed flat. So we're looking at BGS 9.5s instead of PSA 10s. Given the age of this card, it was back when BGS was a bigger player in the grading space, so there are a lot more sales of 9.5s rather than PSA 10s. And so values in the early fall here were in the 200, 250, 300. We even had a couple $350 sales there. I was really thinking that he might jump up to $400 or $500 here, and it just never happened because he didn't go to a big market team, and he ultimately landed in the $250 to $300 range. So he's another name where it didn't work out, and that just goes to show that this is not a guarantee. We're taking a best guess as to what might happen, but for this play to work out, we needed something very specific to happen, which was that he would go to a bigger market team. And since that didn't happen, it's no surprise that his cards didn't actually move. Now, the final category I call MVP candidates, and it's the players that are probably the most obvious. So if you look at this category, I only had 3 names on the list. So Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani, and Paul Skeens. And when you think about why would we target players like this? Well, when you're targeting the best of the best in the game, there's almost always going to be demand for their cards. And especially leading into the season, that's where we see an increase in demand as all this attention comes back and people are looking at, where do I put my money? Well, the safest place is typically going to be in those best players because we already know what to expect from them. And over the history of the card market, those top tier players are the ones that have the strongest history of holding and rising in value over time, especially when we target their rarer cards. You want to see how their numbers turned out? Shohei Ohtani up 177% between September 1st and March 31st. So massive, massive win there if you picked up any Ohtani cards. Judge was up by 61%, and even Skeens, a pitcher, and some people don't like pitchers as well, but Skeens is in a different category if you ask me, and he saw a rise of almost 46% between September and March. So the message here with the MVP candidates especially is that you don't always have to go out and try to find that sleeper pick. Like a lot of times folks are trying to pick the diamond in the rough when they do better if they just pick the guys that the market already cares about and already wants to buy. So if we zoom all the way out and we look at what is happening here, it's really the same pattern showing up time and time again. And the fun part is we don't actually have to pick the perfect player. If we can just figure out the right types of players that we know the crowd is likely to be in on, that's what sets us up for success with this strategy. And the key is this isn't a one-time thing. The players change, but the strategy and the pattern don't. So once you understand how this works, you can rinse and repeat from one year to the next, or even from one sport to the next. And speaking of which, here's a reminder that you can get my NFL and NBA guides right now inside Ignite. Links in the description if you want to see details and join us. But either way, I hope you realize that once you start to understand the patterns, you can get out ahead of the crowd instead of always feeling like you're playing catch up.